title of the series in that case would be Indian writing in English and in English translation. So it's a wider thing, wider field, wider region, and issues also are going to be more than otherwise would have been the case. If you remember, way back a decade ago, some such thing was presented in a slightly brief form, and we focused on only one aspect, that was the Indian writing in English. But this time we thought that the text had been changed in the universities, and new areas of communication, new areas of perceiving things also came up. Therefore, in light of that, we can widen the scope of this particular course and add new texts, and the old ones can be avoided. All this will carry on as the program unfolds. So, in the beginning, we have Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University, to speak on the course in general today. She will give an introductory comment on the course. And the other thing that one has to keep in mind is that English writing in India is particularly young. It came up largely, Dr. Bajaj will tell us more about it, in the 19th century itself, but it flowered also, not exactly in the early 20th century, but in the post-independence period in India. So, all these things will come up historically, culturally, etc., and some kind of introduction is needed, because it's a different field of knowledge, different field of perception. And we generally look at our own culture and problems from our languages, but in this case, it's the medium of communication is through English, and that edits on its own terms certain areas which otherwise might have intruded upon the imagination. So all these things have to be kept in mind, and without any further comment on this, I hand over the mic, so to say, to Dr. Bajaj, and please give us the introductory comments and raise questions.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Yes, we'll be introducing today Indian literatures in English, basically, those that have been written in English and the others that have been translated as well. So, as you know, the scope of this is really wide, and we would like to include texts that have not been covered yet, and also texts that are a part of university syllabi. But as today's lecture is basically on trying to understand and locate Indian writing in English, it's very important to understand these terms separately. In fact, I would suggest that we look at it as a kind of a modern Indian literatures in English, because we are looking at texts from 19th century onwards mostly, and we are going to build a kind of a narrative around that when modernity, so to speak, set in India. And when we speak of modernity, then modernity takes place or comes, what is so special about 19th century then? Why are we talking about literatures written in 19th century? One, because the writers begin to write in the 19th century in a very different way, and there is a profound shift from the earlier kind of writing that India saw, and how that shift gets defined in the 19th century is what we'll also talk about, and which is why I said modernity is an important word when we speak of this shift. Because this is when writers begin to realize that literature should not merely focus on fables and folk tales or tales of magic or morality. Rather, literature and literary works should represent life as it existed at the time, or the social reality at the time. So, the emphasis on life as lived and reality as experienced by people becomes the kind of center for a lot of writing in the 19th century in India, and which is why I say it's a shift from the earlier sort of literature of the Arabian Nights, or like Tota Maina Ki Kahani sort of a thing, or Bital Pachisi. Those were the kind of things that were being written initially, and which were basically meant for entertainment, or spoke of a world that was largely imaginary and belonged to the realm of the fantastic. But in this case, 19th century set in motion a kind of a new kind of writing, where you saw that the language, the culture, the social reality of people, these were the issues that were being talked about. In fact, 19th century in a way is also known as the century of reform, and also constantly refer to it as Bengal Renaissance, for instance. Now, what are the things? What are these things? How did these come into form? I mean, how did these take shape? These are some of the questions that we'll be dealing with in the course of our series. But to begin, what is most important, according to me, is that I don't know to what extent you'd agree with this, but what is most important is that the introduction of English in India, that in fact became a very important moment in how we, or as a base on which you can actually, or as a foundation on which you can place this entire category of Indian writing in English. Of course, as we speak of, I mean, we are constantly, the word English is important here. We are not talking about Indian writing. We are talking about Indian literatures that have been written in English or have been translated into English. So obviously we've left out a lot of indigenous, and that is a limitation of this series, and perhaps we can have another series which is totally based on vernacular literatures, right? But the fact that what joins all the two categories that we are talking about today, what joins them is English. And so we need to understand how English studies came into being in India, how they were, they were placed in the curriculum, how an entire set of values came along with when English was being taught in schools, and a new generation came into came up in India that could read in English and write in English and could understand, and that also set in motion this process of translation. Once it was available, obviously translation happened at two levels. One, obviously done by Westerners who were were interested in the East, and they would then come to India and translate some of the texts and make them available to the audience abroad in the West. Max Muller comes to mind for that. But the other kind of translation that also came up was Indian people who got in touch with English and were also then began the process of translating works into the vernacular. So it was a two-way process, the translation activity, and how that created a dynamic and a fervor in the literary space is again something we need to look at and discuss as we go along in this series. Well, how would you like to comment on this?
No, it's, I agree entirely with you that the word modernity is important, because modernity is not there in the 18th century in India. It comes in the 19th century, and that brings with it all kinds of factors in life, ideological, political, social factors. And you talked about reform. So reform is also an important word in the context, and reform along what lines? And well, scientific temper and objectivity, and what you see, as you said, lived life. Now, this wasn't the case with most of the writing in India at that time in the languages of the place. And a shift, definitely a dramatic, crucial shift took place in the 19th century, as you point out very well. And it's a two-way process. The other thing, and I not only agree, but I entirely endorse and adopt this idea that it's a two-way process, that when you read English, you also think in English, and you try to understand your own literature through the language English, and that's the lens, that's an important lens. And English language is not language in the 19th century or even today. It's a kind of a mirror, it's a kind of a medium, and the moment you adopt this medium, then certain things happen in their own course. So we have an English writing in India in the hands of the English writers who came and talked about it, taught it in certain courses, and we have Indians who learnt English with their help and started looking at their own selves from the English lens there. So it's a very educative kind of a series in that sense, and that's why I think the course makers in the different universities have become attracted towards it, and now we have a whole gamut of writing being taught in the classes in English, and that English comes from. And imagine the scope of English also in the 20th century is not the same as the 19th century. You have American literature, you have Latin American literature. American is English, but at the same time it is American. And Latin American literature, which means that it comes through translation. So many varieties. Russian literature, French literature, they are part English and part European, and that connects them. So it's a very rich kind of an area, and I believe that we would be able to do justice to this kind of variety, this kind of complexity that is there in the Indian writing in English and Indian writing in English in translation. And the second thing that you say is that 19th century is important. So in that case, the Sanskrit literature, the literature of the medieval period, of the Bhakti Kalin will be there. Naturally, 19th century didn't drop from above, and it was partly produced by the 18th century, and therefore folk tales and myths also would be there, but only the calling would be through English. So that I think is a broader definition that you project here, and that will be kept in mind always, and we'll choose texts which have been discussed earlier and those which have not been discussed. So
yeah. In fact, what I mean, I'm glad you picked up the point of Bhakti tradition also. What is interesting to note in the 19th century, and that is also a part of the modern, is that there is a kind of a kind of a rupture, you could say, that takes place. And I just feel that both ancient and medieval literatures in India have focused a lot on the gods and the goddesses. There is a very devotional sort of a medieval literature is very devotional when we speak of Bhakti Sufi traditions. Earlier traditions of ancient India, there was politics, there was economics, and they were social in their tenor, but at the same time they carried a very strong sense of the godly and the divine, right? And the gods and the divine were always a part of this larger social dynamic that was played out even in ancient literatures, I feel. But when we come to modern literatures, when we come to the 19th century, I feel that the writers, there is a the link is severed in that sense, the link between the divine and the human is left to one's own agencies. And there is an awareness in 19th century then that the human, it has to work within one's own circumstances, and have a kind of a personalized, imagined relationship with gods, because the gods are not going to come down and help anymore, right? And but they are not blinded by devotion either, in the sense that they are constantly being put to some kind of a check, and then their own human agency is called forth, or their human potential is being tested, or their capabilities are being tested. So I think 19th century also presents to us or centers the human being, or while decentering the divine. I think that's something which is very interesting and important, that takes shape in the 19th century. Also, where you mentioned that I was thinking of De Rosio, for instance, who came to India and set in motion an entire movement called the Young Bengal movement. All this is taking shape because I think Indians are now becoming aware of a culture and of a language and literature of the West, and particularly England, but also all the Russian, French literature that is available in translation in English. So I think that the introduction of English then becomes a very important point to be discussed in this series, and one may think of how that actually took shape. To think of it, that Christian missionaries came into India, and there obviously, as Christian missionaries, it was their job to convert people to Christianity, and they wanted to spread the the word of God, and therefore they offered free education, for instance, to people from lower caste backgrounds and the poor, and it so happened that they were able to convert a lot of people to Christianity, and even if they weren't, then there was a spread of education which was done in English, right? So the English language or English literatures, English education comes into being, comes into force with the Christian missionaries who came to India and started to make their base in India. Then of course we have Macaulay's minutes and Macaulay's educational policies that were put in place, the setting up of schools and colleges. Now as you see, the British as colonizers face this very real problem that if they wanted to govern the country and administer it properly, then it was very important for them to learn the language of the country and make the people learn the language of the country. But obviously it was a mammoth sort of a task, and they would not be able to do it. One, because India was not like England. It did not have one language, right? And in fact it did not even have one religion. So in that sense it created a lot of problems for the Britishers to learn the local languages, no matter how much they did. So they found it better to teach a group of people their own language, who could then disseminate the ideas or disseminate whatever information had to be passed down to the mass population. So in that sense they brought in so it was an agenda of their own. The Christian missionaries, a religious angle, that they wanted to convert people to Christianity, so spreading of English language and all of that. The other was more political, and the other reason was more logistic, in fact, that they wanted to make sure that they could govern better, and therefore they set up schools and colleges, and introduced Western education. Now this Western education worked as a double-edged sword, in fact, because they taught the English language, but they gave the tools of the master, so to speak, worked against the master, because now writers, thinkers, a new generation was there in India, particularly in Bengal, who in the 19th century became aware of revolutionary ideas coming from France, Russia and England itself. Like, they realized that England in itself spoke of equality and justice, rationality. Its own writers were writing about, think of all the romantic writers, Shelley and Wordsworth. They're all talking about revolution, Blake including. So they read a lot of these writers who were available in English, now available to them, and they understood that fighting for justice is what human beings do, and suffering and accepting passively injustice is completely wrong. And this is the new idea that they found in English literatures. So English language brought in English literature, and with the introduction of this kind of English literature, you found that people changed themselves, And on this point, in fact, there is a quote, very interesting quote from E.V. Ramanujan's Indigenous Imaginaries, that's his book, in which he writes, and I quote, "The introduction of English into India set in motion a series of profound changes in the very manner in which we think of language, literature and culture. The arrival of English and the advent of print shared the same episteme, and they reinforced control over the minds of the people of India by setting normative practices of reading and writing that had far-reaching consequences for the entire country." Unquote. How do you react to this? In fact, let me finish. There is one more section to it, and then I'll probably come to you. He further notes, nothing in the preceding centuries had prepared Indians for the massive reorganization of culture, language and knowledge that took place subsequently in the 19th century. Yeah?
No, actually, what is at play in this particular quotation also is that the horizon of even Europe and horizon of England also is widening.
Right.
Because they didn't have any colonies till the 18th century, and now they have colonies to manage. So they have to learn from the colonies, and they also have to teach certain things to the people who are in the colony. And this two-way process, widens for both of them. So English language also becomes quite rich in the 19th century because of the aspect of colonialism entering the particular domain. So it's a.
But for the colonial practice, for the colonial English, it is always their vocabulary is enriched by words that negate and find the other in the colony. So, but for the 19th century, for the 19th century Indian population. You see, what happens is what here E.V. Ramanujan really focuses on is also the print culture that came into being. So the advent of print and the arrival of English, they actually had the same sort of a beginning, and with printing press being set up, you know, in various places in India, now there was mass circulation of texts. So the texts were not just available to a few, but rather the printing, what was also there in the 19th century, in fact in England, you know, the printing itself became a very important way through which people were connected with ideas, you know, 19th century in England. But and that is also, the press has already reached India in the 19th century. In fact, a lot of people, for instance, like Fakir Mohan Senapati, he set up his own printing press and set up his own local newspaper in Odisha. So you can see that English, and then add to it the print culture, the setting up of the printing press, they in fact changed the way, according to Ramanujan, this entire way in which the mindset of the Indian people changed in that sense, because reading and writing became the new kind of practice, and a lot of people who could not read would obviously sit together and one of them would just read out and the others would be listeners. So this kind of a dynamic did not exist in preceding centuries, and it caused a sort of a massive reorganization of culture, according to Ramanujan. So
that's true, and in the 19th century, what happens is that the book has started replacing the guru, replacing the pandit, replacing the teller of tales.
Right.
And people don't have to go into a congregation to listen to somebody, but they just have the book in their hand or a printed page in their hands, and in the privacy of their homes, they start learning things. So the shift has taken place from the ear to the eye, and printing press is the culprit there.
Right.
Because
right.
you have the printing press, you have a sheet in front of you, and you are reading through those signs which are there on the page itself.
Right.
So this is a mammoth kind of a thing that you have referred to. In the 19th century, this happens, and this brings about the culture of a different kind. And since you are reading alone in your own privacy, therefore you are also turning individualistic.
Right.
And that individualism is there as the hallmark of romanticism also there. So the two things start connecting in a different way, and a new dialectic, as you say, is formed in the process.
Right, that's true. And then he further goes, okay, I think, and I've just been in my lecture confusing the names, it is A.V. Ramakrishnan. If I mention Ramanujan, then that's a problem. That is A.K. Ramanujan, we'll come to that. So anyway, the quote that I mentioned is from E.V. Ramakrishnan. Now, this particular quote also is valid in this context, and let me just read that out. Again, it says that once Sanskrit and Persian were displaced from their position of distinction and dominance, English came to occupy that space. And with that, modern Indian languages came under the compulsion to approximate to the norms set by English in education and production of knowledge. Unquote. Yeah.
No, the very idea of production of knowledge, this was not thought to be like that. Knowledge had to be spread. But here, you are giving that individuality to the person who perceives, and therefore this person or a group of these people, they start producing things of their own, sitting together, discussing things, reaching conclusions which they didn't earlier anticipate, and therefore a new kind of education, and literature through education or education through literature, that becomes the dialectic of the 19th century. It's
Right.
not there in the 18th century.
Right. So, in a way, what he's suggesting here is that Sanskrit and Persian, they were displaced from their position of dominance, and in its place, English came to occupy that space. And then he says that modern Indian languages then, which is what is spoken on the street, right, languages that people spoke, and people, not necessarily the refined languages, but the language that was spoken on the street, probably Hindustani is what he refers to. So these modern Indian languages then had to approximate to the norms set by English in education and in knowledge. Now, what also then sets into motion is another practice, which is the standardization of Indian languages. I'm thinking of the books on grammar, etc., that are written, essays that are written on, books are being dictionaries are being published, and a new script is coming to the fore, which tells us what a language needs to have. So I mean, I'd like you to comment on the standardization of Indian languages that took shape or took place at the end of the 19th century.
That maybe it is because of the classroom also. You know, when you have the classroom in the college or in a university, then you have the teacher has to tell what is accepted and what is not accepted, what is clear and what is not clear, and the standardization then begins occurring in the practice of learning, in the practice of education, etc.
Yes. So these are, in fact, there were journals devoted to in the towards the last part of the 19th century to to fixing the norms in Indian in language. For instance, Hindi, for instance, was becoming more fixed in its structure and in grammar, and becoming and approximating therefore to English in that sense, which had its own grammar and structure in place, right? So the language itself is evolving, or the Indian language also gains from the introduction of English, because then it needs to become more precise and structured and fixed, and not a kind of a loose structure. In fact, this was something that took place all over Indian languages, and with the printing culture, this was again standardized, right? So I think all these things together give rise to both.
Printing culture means a set kind of spelling.
That's what I mean.
The writer would straight away say, the speaker would straight away say, no, this is not the word, the word is this.
Right.
It's because you have the picture of the word in front of you on the page.
Right, exactly. So this is what I meant, that what the print culture, what the introduction. So English as a language became the kind of a norm that, okay, this is how language needs to be written. And it gave a sense of structure to all other Indian languages as well. So the development of language and literatures happened in a way simultaneously in the 19th century. So I think that is something which is, and this kind of exposure to Western culture that we speak of, it strongly influenced writers at the time, in the 19th century, who were beginning to write in English. Especially one can think of Bengali literature. There's also, a lot being written in the 19th century in India.
Yes, that's true. And friends, so far we have discussed, the process in which English starts occupying an important place in Indian writing, and that happens, as Dr. Richa Bajaj has pointed out, in the 19th century, where things started from scratch. And let's say the Hindu college, foundation of the Hindu college, in 1810 or so, which means the beginning of the 19th century, and from there, becoming a whole movement called the Young Bengal movement that she has referred to. And this kind of a process, this kind of a dynamic which is being formed in the 19th century is going to take English writing in India forward, plus to enrich it with the help of the English literature that was being written in England or in other countries like USA, and in translation the Russian and the French literatures also were at that time available. So a kind of standardization, a kind of modernity, a kind of new outlook, new humanism, all that is ingrained in the 19th century, and therefore it would be apt to say that Indian writing in English actually is an offshoot of this entire complex social process. So we come to the end of the first part of the discussion, and in the second part things will be more specifically mentioned, so that we are able to form a view of Indian writing in English in a generally accepted form. Thank you.